Hello, hello. Thank you for joining. Hello, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Okay, so I can see some people already here having waited. Um, and we'll give anyone else who'd like to join another minute or so. Welcome back in the meantime to our My EdSpace free streams for Key Stage 5 for English literature. Today and in this unit, we will be looking at A Streetcar Named Desire. This is actually our fourth lesson on A Streetcar Named Desire. And this lesson will be specifically on the character of Stella Kowalski, who is Blanche's sister and Stanley's husband, or Stanley's wife. Stanley is her husband. So many of you have already joined for our unit on Othello, which took place over September and October. And that gave us a really broad but also deep dive into the analysis, the lines of arguments, the characters and themes of Othello. Hello, IGCSE. Thank you for joining us. Hello, Takunda. Thank you for joining us as well. Feel free to pop into the chat just so that I know who it is who's here. And if you are a veteran at this point, then looking forward to hearing your contributions. If this is your first time joining these lessons, hello, Zemi, as well. Then you may want to start with this lesson just to get a taste of what these lessons are like, or maybe you have a mock upcoming for A-level on Stella in particular, or you'd like to revise specifically on Stella. If not, then you might want to go back and watch these live streams in order so that you're introduced first to the plot and the characters and the context, and then also talking about the conventions of modern drama, and then we also looked at the plot in very much detail, as well as Blanche Dubois, one of our most important characters in our last lesson that we looked at. Either way, let's get started looking at Stella Kowalski and A Streetcar Named Desire. So if this is your first lesson, then I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My EdSpace. I've been teaching A-level for a long time, and I look forward to sharing my knowledge with you as part of these free streams where we will be giving and holding free streams for A-level students, not only in English, but also in all of the different subjects available that we offer so that you can be supported in your A-level journey or you can learn something. So let's get started with a review about Stella. So any ideas that you know about Stella, put them into the chat. Just a bit of a division here so we can think about different ideas regarding Stella and her relationships here. And then we'll do a big mind map to sort of start thinking about arguments and different elements of Stella's character that we want to address. Okay, so feel free to pop into the chat some adjectives that describe Stella. Certainly some come to mind. As we looked at Blanche last lesson, you may be thinking about antonyms to Blanche's character as well. Okay, so as people are typing, I will kick us off with looking at some adjectives to describe Stella. Here, for example, we've got realistic, unlike the idealistic Blanche. We've also got her being pragmatic, another way of discussing that same idea there of characters who are much more grounded in realism and much more practical. We've also got her as an affectionate character, not only with her husband, but also with her sister and her baby, as we can see. So again, caring here, and seemingly the one who's caring is the most externalized, as she's the character who displays the most caring for other people as compared to herself. With this as well, we have what her caring looks like, particularly with her husband, is as a kind of submissiveness, because she is certainly submissive to her husband, but she's also passionate here, particularly in her relationship with her husband. We can say that she's resilient. We can describe her as devoted, as dependent, perhaps. And interesting there, we start to think about her much more in similarity to Blanche than otherwise, this idea of dependence, or even delusion, right? The fact that she's deluded about perhaps her husband, about her situation there. Is she, for example, self-preserving? Or is she selfish? And this ties into particularly her final decision about choosing to believe her husband's version of events than over Blanche's, her sister's, when Blanche tells her, not in view of us, but off stage, that Stanley raped her. And there we have her choosing, perhaps, as she says, and as Eunice seems to imply as well, this idea of self-preservation, of having to go on. But also, is that selfish? Is that betrayal, really, of her sister and of womankind by choosing to believe her husband over her sister? Hello, thank you for joining us, Joe. Great. We're just getting started with Stella. And then, in what ways is Stella different to Blanche? Well, she's certainly more resilient. She's far less delicate, even in stature. Right? Blanche says that she weighed the same as she did 10 years ago when father died and you left us. Whereas she says that Stella has become a little bit more rotund. She doesn't know that Stella's actually pregnant. But certainly this also indicates a kind of mentality that they both have. Blanche is much more fragile and vulnerable than Stella is. In a way, though, she's also less transgressive. Zemi, Blanche is more impractical, exactly. So the flip side of Blanche's impracticality, Stella's practicality. But also, if we think about it, Stella is the one who's less transgressive in a way. She's married. She's pregnant. We don't know if she was having sex with people outside of marriage before Stanley, but we certainly know she's not anymore. So she is in this kind of more societally accepted role and position here. And also perhaps acceptable, because it is Blanche's meetings with strangers, as she says, so really having sex with different people who she didn't know, or certainly in particular not married to. There we have her as actually the more transgressive of the two. With this as well, we also have her as this kind of oops, not my thing. This idea of her being able to survive. She's much more adaptable. She changes, unlike Blanche, who resists change and thus is unable to survive in this new world. Disrespectful. Well, we're not thinking about our judgment of her. We're thinking about how society at the time would have judged them. Yes. Then in what ways is Stella different to Stanley? Well, she, if you're thinking about this, Joe, is she's much more respectful than Stanley. much more sort of in tune with society's rules and with what is acceptable and what is not, particularly thinking about the way he speaks in front of people and the way he treats her in front of people he doesn't like. She also has an upper class background and he is working class. Her manners and etiquette are different than Stanley's. She says they have different notions. Apologies, just making sure everything is good with the chat. Okay. With manners and etiquette, yes, they have different notions. Then here as well, we've got her as much more sensible, calm, polite, and also much more forgiving than Stanley. Stanley who holds a grudge against Blanche. Stanley who is volatile. Stanley who's violent, and she is much different to that. Then, what is the dynamic between Stella and Blanche like? Well, in a way, it's kind of one-sided, right? We see Blanche absolutely dominating the conversation. Blanche, as Zemi says, babies Stella. So this kind of infantilization where she says, "Oh, Stella for star, my precious lamb, precious baby sister," etc. Yes. We also have it, though, as accommodating. So as I said, Stella waiting on Blanche, this kind of idea of understanding, but also awareness of each other, familiarity with each other, where Stella knows about Blanche in a way that Blanche can't hide the same way she can from Mitch, for example. But Stella is also the person who explains about Blanche to Stanley. For example, when Stanley, she feels, is being too harsh to Blanche, says, well, she was the most trusting person, and people like you, she says to Stanley, made her who she is now. So essentially corrupted her or made her upset enough to be like this now, this fragile now. Then the dynamic between Stella and oh, well, firstly, at the end, this is changed, right? And it is Stella absolutely babying Blanche, but also betraying her. So this kind of role reversal. There's also this kind of idea of betrayal here. Sure. Then with Stella and Stanley, again, we have this idea of it being very one-sided. Here. But it's also, and so there is this power dynamic that is extremely critical to understanding the two of them. But it's also, as I said, passionate. It's loving, it's physical, it's intimate. For sure. And again, it's this idea of being forgiving as well. Good, glad you get the gist. We're going to get much deeper into it, so don't worry. This is just a review in case people haven't studied this for a long time or are using this as revision in advance of mocks. Then, what news does Stanley tell Blanche about Stella? He tells her that Stella is going to have a baby. Something that Stella doesn't want Blanche to know until she is more settled. We also know that's not going to happen. But this baby that Blanche seems to be excited about, and we will see more about this baby going forwards. But then finally, what does Stella represent? What does Stella represent? Well, we've got these ideas, for example, of if Stanley is this New South or modern society, and Blanche is the Old South, then Stella might represent this bridge or conduit. Same idea, both can be metaphorical, between the Old South and the New South. This point of connection between them. She is also an example of these class relations between classes in the new world, in this modern era. I wouldn't say that she's a tunnel. And Jo, I would say the hybrid would be the baby, because the baby is really important to Stella's character here. This would be the hybrid between the different classes, or the mixing, the moving away from homogeneous classes, right? With this as well, she could also represent this idea of, if we're talking about being adaptable, the survival of the fittest from Darwin, where this Stella is the way that society has to adapt going forward, particularly in terms of class, in order to survive here. And then the same for if we think about women here. What does she represent? She may represent women, the experience of women in particular, in a patriarchal society. Now, what do I mean by patriarchal? I mean a society run and controlled by men. Because her experience is one in which she is inculcated or brought into and socialized within patriarchal society, and she is trapped in this role of mother and wife, and we can see that this still is an experience, not as in the 50s propaganda was guiding one to believe, of fulfillment here, but instead as one who was trapped and silenced and eternally forced to be forgiving or blinded by the constraints and the limitations of patriarchal society. Yes, so the baby is the next generation, exactly that. And Stella, as the mother, is the way of carrying that through. So with this then, we want to think about the different ideas if we get a question about Stella or how she's presented as a character. Then we want to think about these different line of arguments or different ideas we would most certainly want to talk about when or if we have this on an exam question. What are the key ideas about Stella? Well, one of them, as Jo said, is the baby as the next generation. And this generation of a melting pot America. And this expression, melting pot, is a very American one, kind of written into the ethos of the country as this idea of many, many different cultures and experiences mixing together in America. Unlike, for example, in England, where the class structure and system is such that it is dependent on one's birth circumstances, and unlike America, doesn't change throughout one's life, whereas in America, one's class can change with their circumstances. So here, melting pot America and this idea of one's circumstances changing and then making it is called the American dream. So the baby then is crucial. We can also say, as we said, her as a conduit between Blanche and Stanley. And thus the Old South and the New South, or the modern era. Most certainly, because these two do not work together, right? So their language, the two of them, their language doesn't translate. So she serves as this kind of go-between or translator, bridging the gaps between these two cultures. Most certainly. With this as well, we can also think about her relationship with Blanche. And the differences as well as the similarities between them. So they both, for example, suffer, but only one survives. And I'll put survives in quotations because technically Blanche does live at the end of the play. But, you know, who's to say? Okay. Then we can also think, as I said, about her relationship with her husband, because that is also multifaceted. In one instance, there's this idea of violence and control and power, which leads to her submission. But then there's also this idea of desire and sex here that drives their relationship and really does underline the importance of physicality within their relationship. Now, these two are most certainly related, but particularly this seems to win out in this dynamic. So yes, Stanley is abusive, but Stella says that she is not in anything she wants to get out of. That's important, right? That she is choosing this because she is prioritizing sex and desire over the possibility of violence and power here. Now, with this as well, this link and linking with the baby as well is this idea, as I said, but of survival here. Choosing to marry Stanley and to stay with him rather than choosing Blanche links to this idea of survival. So we could certainly do that as a paragraph in and of itself. Oops. There, an adaptation as necessary. We also, with her, have this idea of her being trapped in a patriarchy. We also have what she's like as a character. She's realistic. She's pragmatic. She is a counterpoint or a foil to both characters here. For sure. We can even think of her as linked to someone like Eunice, who seems to be the older version of what Stella has become. This older version who, yes, is also abused by her husband, but also abuses them back. Now, these are some ideas of what we can talk about here with Stella, but it's a good point that we started thinking about how many different elements of Stella, who doesn't talk as much as either Stanley or Blanche, really gives us as a character. Then let's look at the name of the characters. Well, even Stella's name itself here links to this idea of a literal marriage between two classes. But which one wins? Stanley's wins. Not only because she takes his name, but she also then takes on his class. She has his baby, which ensures that this name, Stanley's name, will go on. And it is this Dubois name that is relegated to history. Yeah. Relegated means leaves behind. So it literally, their name dies out because Blanche doesn't have a baby and Stella's baby will be a Kowalski. It's preserving his line, preserving his immortality, cementing his status and life in America. And in society. With this as well, we've got the Stella as well. Stella, as we said, as Zemi said, Blanche babies her. Well, let's think about what Stella and the Stella for Star business is here. Stars, what are they a symbol of? If Stella, the literal name, means star, well, we've got idealism, we've got hope, we've got light. Ooh, if we've suddenly got light and hope here, we're already thinking about the contrasts to Blanche here, right? Who avoids the light and who has no hope because she is unable to let go of the past. With this as well, we have guidance, as in the stars are used for guidance. So this as a perhaps model for going forward in society, as well as distance here as well. For Blanche, Stella is unreachable. She cannot grab Stella and take her back to the past. But if we're thinking about the past and stars, we can also think about this idea of fate and it being in the stars. So this idea of moving on. And being adaptability or being adaptable, being needed for history to continue or life to continue is also really interesting here. With this as well, perhaps with Blanche and this idea of wanting to take her back into the past, with the pet names as well, the Stella for Star, that sounds like something she would have said when she was little, right? So this returning to past pet names or past epithets, perhaps is this attempt to reclaim the past. But we know that Stella doesn't really respond to them. anymore. And she certainly doesn't respond in kind to Blanche. She just really calls Blanche Blanche or Honey, which was something very common in the South at the time. So that doesn't really work. So here we have this kind of outdated, old-fashioned reference to Stella that doesn't suit her anymore. And this then underlines Blanche's inability to move on because she's still thinking about the past, and she is the only one who can't see that Stella is a grown woman who is not going to be responding to things like this. Interestingly as well, with stars, we also want to think about the sort of Greco-Roman link with stars and virginity or purity, which seems ironic due to the clearly sexual experience of Stella with her husband. Leading us back, of course, to the title A Streetcar Named Desire. This desire being something that is determining one's fate. With Stella, the same as with Blanche, right? The fact that her desire has led her to Stanley and means that she will not leave him, even though he abuses her and rapes her sister. And perhaps she knows this but cannot bring herself to admit it. Interestingly, though, with this infantilization, we have that here as well. In both. So with these old South values, as well as in the modern era, 1947, are both of them infantilizing women in society and women's role and status in society? So women's status remains inferior, subservient, submissive in both. And isn't this a real issue here? Because like with Stella for Star, we've got I want my baby here. Interestingly, we've got the possessive pronouns here. And a lot of Stanley's language and actions, so the stage directions linking him with Stella physically, have to do with ownership and possession here as well. So possessive pronoun linking to control and power, possession, dominance, etc. But baby is that infantilization as well as love and affection and desire. But then we've got the down here as well, because though this isn't a command, I want my baby down here, it is indicating his desire for control of where she is, his insistence, very demanding tone, even if it's not a command itself, but also this idea of down. I want my baby down here, not up here. Tennessee Williams could very easily have played with ups and downs here, but he's always having Stella come down to meet Stanley. So this idea of bringing her down to his level. And that's not bringing Stella down as in her mood, but sort of controlling her position in society here, as well as thinking about, in terms of class, she is not elevating him up to her class. He doesn't even want to be part of her class. He wants to bring her down to his level, this kind of equity between them, but determined by him. And then that calling, 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 literally a summons, right? He's summoning her. Raka, Diane, hello. Thank you for joining. And let's take a look at the initial impression of Stella, shall we? So Stella comes out on the first floor landing, a gentle young woman, about 25, and of a background obviously but quite different from her husband's. So this is when, and we're going to look at the broader view of Stella's introduction here, but these are the first and really only information we have about Stella here, other than later the fact that her tummy is sort of curving with maternity, etc. We don't really get a physical description of her. It doesn't seem that looks were really an important element to her character. With Stanley, yes. With Blanche, yes. But with Stella, it's much more guided by her relationship, particularly her sexual relationship with Stanley and the kind of counterbalance that she is with his. So firstly here, we have this idea of her, yes, as we said, being above, being above at the start, the first floor landing, above Stanley at the start. This is not just physically, but also in terms of class here. We have her as a gentle young woman. This certainly couldn't describe either Blanche or Stanley, right? So we have these elements of delicacy with Blanche. We have power with Stanley. But with Stella, we kind of have this passivity and this sweetness. She is kind of docile and subservient, but she's also quite calm here, which is important. With this, we also have her being 25, so she's young, she's impressionable, but also compared to Blanche, and if we're thinking about this information that we have, the information we have about when Stella left Belle Reve was that it was about 10 years ago. So here that implies that Stella left when she was about 15. So Blanche got married when she was about 16 and Stella left when she was about 15. So yes, she's young and impressionable at 25, but certainly not so much as when she was 15 and new to the city. Apologies, my screens are just flicking at me, so I will fiddle them for a moment. Okay. Should be good now. And as I say, we've got this idea of her being a young woman, and at this time, 1947, she most certainly would be married and expected to be having children here. So she is certainly viewed as an adult who would have been an adult during the war as well. She met Stanley, he was a soldier, right? And then here, of an other background, obviously quite different from her husband's here. Now, what does this look like? Is this to do with her clothing, which isn't really described across the text? Is this to do with her comportment, so the way she carries herself and behaves? Is this to do with some inherent quality of hers? that she's obviously but indefinably part of the upper class? It's hard to say. We don't really put a finger on it. But certainly, this background being different from her husband's here is a defining quality of hers. We don't have the color of her hair. We don't have the shape of her face. We don't have what she's wearing even. But we do have the fact that her class being different from her husband's as important here. So the disparity between them is immediately highlighted. Disparity between them, between Stella and her husband, is highlighted immediately as a defining part of the dynamic between them. Good. And we could see that, as I said, starting from the first floor landing, this idea of her across the play descending to become more like her husband. Now, she doesn't express violence and brutality at the end of the play the same way that Stanley does, but in refusing to believe her own sister's account of rape, couldn't we say that that is a similar kind of rejection of Blanche as Stanley has and of Mitch has as well? And then let's look at the initial impression of Stella in more detail. So here we have the whole element of the first scene here before Blanche arrives. And so we've got here, I'm going to read out loud and just feel free to pop into the chat what stands out to you here, and we'll talk about a couple of important elements, okay? So Stanley, bellowing, "Hey there, Stella, baby!" Stella comes out on the first floor landing, a gentle young woman, about 25, and of a background obviously quite different from her husband's. Stella, mildly, "Don't holler at me like that. Hi, Mitch. Catch." "What?" "Meat." He heaves the package at her. She cries out in protest, but manages to catch it. Then she laughs breathlessly. Her husband and his companion have already started back around the corner. Calling after him, "Stanley, where are you going?" "Bowling." "Can I come watch?" "Come on." Okay, so here then we've got a couple of different elements here. Firstly, again, we've got these referential strategies here of Stella being described here as baby and being summoned there, literally yelling up to her here to get her attention. So power, coming called, dominant, etc. there being important. This power of the patriarchy, she comes when she's called. And so juxtaposed to Stella's mild, "Don't holler at me like that," and then "Hi, Mitch." Mitch is Stanley's friend, as we know if we've looked at the plot lesson already or know the play. So "Don't holler at me like that." This is not the same kind of imperative as Stanley would use, but certainly does indicate that Stella is able to speak back to her husband. So this kind of, because she has come when she's called rather than entirely refusing to acknowledge that Stanley is calling her, she's able to a certain extent to resist the way that he frames this. And this, in contrast to this, is so stark, isn't it? The bellowing versus mildly, that highlights their characterization as foils really early. Then here with this catch and the meat, firstly here we have this kind of monosyllabic language of Stanley's that again juxtaposes very clearly to Stella's. And then this heaves the package at her. She cries out in protest but manages to catch it. Then she laughs breathlessly. And I've cut this element to it, but the women who are watching this from the porch are laughing at this. And why is that? Well, because this is a kind of euphemism here, sexual innuendo here, where this meat that he is bringing home and heaving at her is an innuendo that in which this meat becomes a phallic symbol. So a symbol linked to male genitalia, in which this interaction of him throwing the meat up to her and her only just being able to catch it is this kind of sexual proprietorship here. This physicality that shows the power dynamic exchanged here as well as the sex exchanged here, and defines this relationship firstly as a raw and carnal relationship, pun unintended, and thinking about this as raw meat and carnal meat, flesh. This idea here, yes, as physical desire and ownership here. Also indicates him as this kind of provider and hunter who, in 1947, this would be the expectations for masculinity at the time. He is fulfilling these expectations, but also can be read differently as this kind of primitive being who is, as I said, monosyllabic and throwing meat at her. It's not exactly the most polite thing to do. And certainly Blanche was horrified by this. So yes, this element here is him hurling himself at her physically. And what's her reaction? First, this cries out in protest. This initial resistance, but then acceptance with the catching it and then laughing breathlessly. Here we have her as feeling both desired as well as delighted by this interaction. One that, as with the evident from the she cries out and protests, she doesn't expect, but she accepts, and what's more, she enjoys. So this is very similar to when Stanley says, I pulled you off those columns and didn't we have a good time? The colored lights going, etc. So this physicality and this sexual dominance and claim of Stanley's, firstly, is unexpected because this is not the type of man or relationship that Blanche and Stella were raised to expect or know with men, but is one that she finds that she enjoys. So very similar to when he goes running around smashing all the lights on her wedding night, on their wedding night. She says she was sort of thrilled by it. Again, this acceptance and enjoyment of this sexual relationship. Then, with this as well, Stanley, where are you going? Bowling, can I come watch? Come on. Again, we have questions versus exclamations and imperatives here. Super again monosyllabic really with Stanley overall. But with Stella, we have asking for information and asking permission here. So again, really highlighting the dynamic from the beginning. It's physical, well, it's dominant, firstly. Secondly, it's sexual. Thirdly, it's about power and permission here, but also acceptance. So she asks, she wants to go and watch him. Does she want to watch bowling as such? No, she wants to spend time with him and watch him bowl. As this kind of display of masculinity and athleticism that we know Stanley excels at. Then let's take a look at a little bit more about women in 1947. So I'm going to read, and then there are a couple of quotations there that really do highlight these key quotations with Stella in terms of her presentation as a woman within a patriarchal system. These ideas we've already started to introduce. So, First performed in 1947, this play speaks to the position of women within society in the post-war era. Women briefly empowered to leadership at home during the war. At home, that means both in the homes as well as on the home front. So in America, when everyone, in terms of the able-bodied men, were at war, were compelled to return to the domestic sphere when men returned to the domestic workforce. The late 1940s and 1950s brought and heralded a return to conservatism and to traditional gender roles that drew from the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity is this culture of women being in the domestic sphere at home, which is drawn really from further back. So Victorian ideas there and even further back. Women were again expected to serve as the ideal wife and mother and to forfeit the freedoms of financial and social independence for one defined by the patriarchal culture of hegemonic masculinity embodied by Stanley Kowalski. In A Streetcar Named Desire, we see three women's negotiation of this role. Blanche depends on men to look after her, both financially and socially, but her history of sexual profligacy and inappropriate relationships with minors condemns her to social exclusion by the end of the play. Eunice Hubble is physically abused by her husband, but appears to be physically abusive to him as well. In a way, their relationship, despite its tumultuousness, belies a sense of equality between the two. Stella, somewhere between these two, is submissive to her powerful and masculine husband. Violence towards her is normalized and she is financially dependent on him. However, she's also seemingly sexually satisfied and as a social superior to her husband, is privy to knowledge to which he does not have access. She also seeks her own pleasure and is able to act as a conduit between these two worlds embodied by Blanche and Stanley. Her pregnancy and baby, and perhaps her acceptance of the new social order, provide her with a different future than Blanche, who is destroyed at the end of the play. So here then we have the importance of Stella if we're thinking with a feminist lens, which I think is important if we're looking at the significance of Stella here, not just in a class way, but also in terms of gender. So, for example, in the quotation in blue, let's take a look at how these ideas appear. Well, Stanley says, "What's all this monkey doings?" Immediately, this idea of kind of belittling animalistic language to belittle her and Blanche's getting dressed and getting ready and their kind of interactions without him. "Oh, Stan," she jumps up and kisses him, to which he accepts with lordly composure. "I'm taking Blanche to Galatoire's for supper and then to a show because it's your poker night." "How about my supper, huh? I'm not going to no Galatoire's for supper." "I put you a cold plate on ice." "Well, isn't that just dandy?" "I'm going to try and keep Blanche out until the party breaks up because I don't know how she would take it. So we'll go to one of these little places in the quarter afterwards and you better give me some money." Now, important, firstly, because we have this belittling of women's role, this expectation that women's spheres were much less complex and much less important than men's, them being confined to the house, this idea of him being a lord, and as we can say in his own language, a king in his own home here, and accepting his due, kind of accepting his lauds and plaudits from Stella. And then asking about his supper. So that's an expectation for women at the time. And it seems that he is not satisfied with this cold plate on ice. The expectations at the time, women are meant to have a hot meal waiting for the time when their man or their husband would come home, regardless of any information they might have about when that time might be. So that was part of their expectation there, is have their dinner ready. So this idea that she's put a cold dinner there for him is unsatisfactory to him here, and here, as we can see. And then Stella saying as well, "You better give me some money." This is important because this suggests the extent in another dynamic of Stanley's control over Stella, is that she needs him to give her money, and this was a common practice at the time. Women at this time were not able to necessarily have financial power themselves, to have their own bank account, or to even have a credit card. That was actually something that women in America were not able to have until 1973. This in 1947, far before that. So this then shows her dependence on him, multiple different ways, as well as his position within the household. Then, here in this purple box here, Stanley voluptuously, soothingly, now honey, now love, now love. He kneels beside her and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. Now, love, now love. So he is comforting her. Yes, good partners are meant to comfort you, right? But we also have this element here, which is even if Stella is sobbing at witnessing her sister being taken away forcibly to a mental institution, that Stanley is still viewing her body and her attention as needing to be focused on him. Yes, he is comforting her, but he is also trying to feel her / engage with her in a romantic / sexual way. So this then goes to show this kind of feeling for her as a prioritization of what's important to him and what will be important to her going forwards. Could we read into this even more, this kind of power dynamic in which she is expected to be this mother figure even to him? Perhaps, yes. But certainly, even as he's comforting her, this element here, this highlighted part here, really does show that he is taking an opportunity, perhaps taking advantage of her mental, emotional distress to fill his own needs. And that women were expected to fulfill the sexual needs of their husbands. Now we're going to take a look at a bunch of different ideas surrounding Stella, and these can then become different lines of argument for you for paragraphs if we're thinking about the structure of an A-level essay in which you're expected to write a thesis statement, so an introduction that introduces the points you'll be making and introduces your lines of argument. And then between 4 and 5 paragraphs of writing here. So with this, let's take a look. One element here is Blanche and Stella's relationship. And I'm going to read some of these out. Some of these quotations we've looked at already when we looked at Blanche. But if we think about wanting to work smarter and not harder for A-level, because there is so much to do for A-level in terms of revision and knowledge, then we want to think about working smarter and not harder and making the information we do know work for us. So as Zemi said, thinking about how Blanche babies Stella, but also earlier on, that Blanche is the more impractical. That is an argument about Blanche, but can we flip it to think about focusing on Stella here? So, for example, come back here now. Oh, my baby, Stella, Stella for star. She embraces her again. I thought you would never come back to this horrible place. What am I saying? I didn't mean to say that. I meant to be nice about it and say, oh, what a convenient location and such. Ha, precious lamb, you haven't said a word to me. You haven't given me a chance to, honey. She laughs, but her glance at Blanche is a little anxious. So here, even in the dialogue between them, we can see the power dynamic, the relationship between them. But we can see this sort of infantilization as well as this condescension here. These attempts to cover this nervous prattling versus the practicality of you haven't given me a chance to, you keep talking. And then the laughing, the sort of laughing off the insult, as well as this anxiousness. She can see through Blanche's sort of performative behavior that something is possibly wrong here immediately. Stella as well. Blanche, I'd forgotten how excitable you are. You're making too much a fuss about this. Am I? Yes, you are, Blanche. I know how it must have seemed to you, and I'm awful sorry it had to happen, but wasn't anything as serious as you seem to take it. In the first place, when men are drinking and playing poker, anything can happen. It's always a powder keg. He didn't seem to know he didn't know what he was doing. He was as good as a lamb when I came back. He's really very, very ashamed of himself. And that makes it all right? No, it isn't all right for anybody to make such a terrible row, but people do sometimes. Stanley's always smashed things. Why on our wedding night, as soon as we came in here, he snatched off one of my slippers and rushed about the place, smashing the light bulbs with it. He did what? He smashed all the light bulbs with the heel of my slipper. She laughs. And you let him? Didn't run? Didn't scream? I was sort of thrilled by it. This is a very revealing part here, where we're thinking about Stella as this passive, accepting, adapting, but perhaps blinded character here to Stanley's violence here, saying, oh, it's always a powder keg. This violence against her is normal. This overly perhaps forgiving nature, which is he's really ashamed of himself, he's good as a lamb. It doesn't make it all right, but people do. Again, this normalization. And then talking about this smashing. So again, seeding this language with violent verbs in particular, smashing the light bulbs, etc. And this being thrilled by it, this violence and desire being linked here in a way that is damaging and alarming, but certainly normalized as well. Then here as well, Blanche looking down at her glass, which shakes in her hand. You've all I've got in the world, and you're not glad to see me. Sincerely. Why, Blanche, you know that's not true. No, I'd forgotten how quiet you are. You never did give me a chance to say much, Blanche, so I just got in the habit of being quiet around you. Now, is this the same thing that Stella does with Stanley? Is this the same adaptability that she is showing with Blanche as a child, as well as saying and being able to cut through Blanche's pretense here with sincerity, as opposed to with cruelty and violence, the way that Stanley does? In a way, Stella's really the only person who can see Blanche or humanize Blanche. Then here as well, you mustn't wait on me. I like to wait on you, Blanche. It makes it seem more like home. I admit I love to be waited on. Here, the power dynamic between them is so clear, right? The fact that Stella, in a certain case, babies Blanche by waiting on her, this subservient role that extends not only to her husband, but also to her sister here. Perhaps then Blanche and Stanley operate in a similar way. Blanche, but you've given in, and it isn't right. You're not old. You can get out. Slowly and emphatically, I'm not in anything I want to get out of. Incredulously. What, Stella? I said I'm not in anything that I have a desire to get out of. Now, this is very clear. It's unambiguous language. She is being firm here and repeating herself in that she is committing here to carrying on with Stanley and does not care about the violence when she thinks about leaving Stanley. Accepting the violence and staying with Stanley is preferable. Here, this is again in contrast to Blanche, who flits moth-like from person to person in order to escape. Stella isn't trying to escape. She's accepted her lot in society. She's made the most of it. Then, and this also prefigures her couldn't accept it, couldn't believe her story, have to go on, her and Eunice at the end. Lars said, stop it, let go of that broom, I won't have you cleaning up for him. Then who's going to do it? Are you? I? No, I didn't think so. So yeah, again, the realism of Stella saying, well, whose role is this then? And really highlighting the role of women within society here. Whose lot is this going to be, if not theirs? Then I couldn't believe her story and going on living with Stanley. Don't ever believe it. Life has got to go on. No matter what happens, you've got to keep on going. And then later, Stella, What have I done to my sister? Oh God, what have I done to my sister? So this realization at the end, once it's too late. Is it her taking responsibility for Stanley here, though, as well, to a certain extent? Perhaps. Is she mourning what's been lost, not just her sister, but what her sister represents? And Eunice, you've done the right thing, the only thing you could do. She couldn't stay here. There was no other place for her to go. So then this idea here of survival here, and Stella really being a survivalist at the end of it. So Hovis here, these are all critical quotations. Hovis says, Blanche is a woman of words, Stella is a woman of action. It's the action that defies a similar fate for Stella. So even if you only remember this quotation here, this is helpful to think about the contrast between Blanche and Stella. Same with Hovis. By contrast, Stella dispenses with the role of the belle and speaks candidly to her husband, trusting him to respect her openness with commensurate tenderness and honesty. Stella fled Belle Reve and the example of her older sister, perhaps because she recognized the dangers of performance. Unfortunately, Stella fails to recognize the dangers of not performing. Unlike Blanche's, Stella's passivity is real, and Stanley takes advantage of it by intermittently bullying her and by virtually denying her a voice in the affairs of their home. Interesting here, right? Thinking about her as this powerless position in society, but also the contrast between her and the performative Blanche. And then Grogan, the emphasis on descent is not only related to class, however, it might also suggest that Stella is lowering herself to Stanley's poor moral standards. So this is the explaining away the violence, etc. of hers, which normalize repeated acts of violence despite the tenderness of the moment that hints at Stanley's personal feelings of self-abasement and Stella's forgiveness, both of which to some degree recalibrate their marital balance. So here then we need both of these parts. We need the descending scene where he's calling out for her. That is critical, but Stella descending to him rather than her going up to him going up to her, then thinks of this as she is accepting and in a way validating and complicit in his behavior because she returns to it and then explains it away. Similarly, we can also think of Stella and Stanley's relationship as highlighting the renegotiation of class dynamics in the post-war period. So here, thinking about the ways in which Stella and Stanley relate to class in a new way, new relationships between different classes, which previously were almost non-existent. I brought you some nice clothes to meet all your lovely friends in. I'm afraid you won't think they're lovely. What are they like? They're Stanley's friends. Interesting, look at that control there. And then this is a slur about Polish people, so I'm not going to say it aloud, actually. They're a mixed lot, Blanche. Heterogeneous types? Oh, yes, types is right. So heterogeneous meaning mixed of different things. So this idea then of Blanche not wanting to like mixed society here. And the clothes that Blanche brings, and clothes are important to Blanche, are not going to be suitable for the clothes, for the people and the society she is mixing with at this point. So her not fitting in and Stella knowing that and knowing that this is a renegotiation in which she is mixing much more with Stanley's friends and that all different kinds of people, like in this melting pot America, are mixed together. Stella also says, you'll get along fine together if you'll just try not to, well, compare him with the men that we went out with at home. Is he so different? Yes, a different species. This word in particular is crucial because that suggests that there is something more at play here than superficial differences between class, but rather a kind of elemental difference between Stanley and his notions and the Dubois upbringing and heritage. So different that they're like different animals here. And what Stella says is, don't compare him to the men we knew at home. So that is important as well, because she's aware of the difference. She knows enough to warn Blanche not to do that, because she knows that Blanche will not like that comparison, but also probably knowing that Blanche won't be able to do that. Because she accepts that things are different from the way they used to be at home, and Blanche cannot do that. Then Blanche says, oh, I'm not going to be hypocritical. I'm going to be honestly critical about it. Never, never, never in my worst dreams could I picture. Only Poe, only Mr. Edgar Allan Poe could do it justice. I suppose, out there, is the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. She laughs, and Stella says, no, honey, those are the L&N tracks. So interestingly here, we've got her linking to 19th century literature. Makes sense, she's an English teacher. But this kind of literary, romantic, but also gothic image, in contrast to the railroad tracks that Stella says that they are. So Blanche's attempts to romanticize, spinning out of control, whereas Stella brings her back to reality and says, nope, those are the railway tracks, which also aligns her with modernity and aligns Blanche again with the past. And this acceptance, whereas Blanche thinks this is the worst nightmare of a place to live, whereas Stella has just accepted it. Then Blanche as well, an officer, a master sergeant in the engineers corps. Those are decorations. He had those on when you met him? I assure you I wasn't just blinded by all their brass. That's not but of course there were things to adjust myself to later. Such as his civilian background. Stella laughs uncertainly. So this idea that she met Stanley when he was an officer, so probably in a very fancy and formal uniform, and that because he's an officer, that gives him a higher status in society than just a soldier. So this is indicative of the fact that Stanley, in this new post-war period, has a higher status because of his bravery and his work in the army. So this merit-based promotion. But Stella saying as well, she wasn't blinded just by those trappings of formality, trappings of class, but she wasn't blinded by that. Playing with sight here is interesting, especially when we think about Blanche and light as well. Stella wasn't blinded by this. She was attracted to him physically, is the implication here. And then later on, she had to accustom herself to his class, because, of course, then it was a done deal. And Blanche pointing out these really clear distinctions between Stanley and men she finds acceptable makes Stella uncomfortable here as well. Blanche as well says, oh, I guess he's just not the type that goes for jasmine perfume, but that maybe he's what we need to mix our blood with now that we've lost Belle Rev. We thrashed it out. I feel a bit shaky, but I think I handled it nicely. I laughed and treated it all as a joke. And then later she says how she flirted with Stella's husband. There we think about this idea of Blanche hitting the nail on the head for once and saying, well, maybe we do need to mix with him. Maybe he doesn't like the same things like jasmine perfume. That is my typical use of ways of flirting with men. So going to have to change that. But maybe he would be good for the continuation of our line. And that is true. She sees it there. Belle Rev, of course, is their plantation, but the name means beautiful dream. So this idea of losing the dream and being brought to reality, something that Stella sees, but also that confrontation between Blanche and Stanley, in which Blanche comes out the victor, is the precursor to the later rape scene where Stanley then overpowers her and her wiles are not enough to allow her to escape. Stanley as well, when we first met, me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as columns. I pulled you down off them columns, and how you loved it, having them coloured lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay until she showed here? So here, Stanley accepting his own status in society, but him also bringing her down in class. So she marries down, so she loses status in society with this. But also he says, and perhaps he's dictating her feelings because we don't hear it from her own words, but she loved it. She loved being brought down to his level, particularly in terms of the satiation she had from sex with him. And these colored lights going, this desire and enjoyment and carnal lust, etc. That's what she liked, and everything was fine until Blanche, this ghost of the past, comes and interrupts everything with these reminders of these class differences. Stanley as well, I want my baby down here. We've seen this one already. Stanley as well, it's a red letter night for both of us, you having an oil millionaire and me having a baby. So here, really, the American dream here. And Stanley, a red letter night, important night here. Stanley having a baby is him completing the American dream, achieving the American dream, because he has made a success of himself. He has married well, and he is having a baby who will be an American citizen. He is as well. But having an American baby and thus preserving his name in America and building this dynasty of Kowalski. And saying the same with Blanche, her idea of the American dream is marrying an oil millionaire and then being protected and safe for life. With this as well, Eunice descends to Stella and places the child in her arms. It's wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Stella accepts the child sobbingly. Here we have the baby becoming this symbol of the next generation, as J.O. said. The pale blue blanket indicating in this case that it's a boy, and thus suggesting to the audience that this is then the continuation of the patriarchy. It's not only a baby, it's a baby that's going to carry on Stanley's name through to the next generation. And Stella accepting this role, being handed the baby, again descending to Stella, who is now ground level, and accepting the baby, so thus accepting symbolically her role. Stella as well say, I couldn't believe her story in going on living with Stanley. We've done this part already, but again, it's helpful for thinking about the choice that she makes here, keeping on going, this preservation in the post-war period. There's a renegotiation happening here. Stella saying, don't you think your superior attitude is a bit out of place? This is earlier in the play. A bit out of place. I'm not being or feeling at all superior, Stella. Believe me, I'm not. It's just this. This is how I look at it. A man like that is someone to go out with once, twice, 3 times when the devil is in you. But live with, have a child by. I have told you I love him. Then I tremble for you. I just tremble for you. I can't help your trembling if you insist on trembling. Well, if you forgive me, he's common. Well, yes, I suppose he is. So again, this acceptance. Previously, Blanche believes, and society would have believed, that if upper class woman was having particularly any kind of relationships or romance with a working class man, when the devil is in you, it's kind of temptation. But she's accepted it, and she said, this is the way it is. So really showing this new way of thinking in post-war America. Williams himself says, it is out of regret for a South that no longer exists that I write of the forces that destroyed it. So here thinking about perhaps Stanley and the baby, but also to a certain extent Stella, leaving behind, getting rid of, rejecting this old South here by rejecting Blanche. That means that the old South is dead entirely. And then Vlasopoulos said, though few readers and viewers side with Stanley, many agree with Eunice's assessment. Life must go on, and the trinity of Stella, Stanley, and the baby at the end represents life. So this renegotiation means that we have to jettison any ideas that will not serve us anymore, including these old class dynamics, because the only way forward, or the only way through is forward, and this is survival. And Ahmed says, Williams uses Blanche's and Stella's dependence on men. Interesting that that's linked there, because we don't really think of Blanche and Stella in the same way dependent on men, but certainly they both are in different ways. To expose and critique the treatment of women during the transition from the old to the new South. Okay, so there then we have Stella really being this kind of sacrifice here as she serves that conduit between the two of them. So Blanche is angry at her for lowering herself to Stanley. Stanley is angry at her for being condescending to him, and she's caught in the middle of this. We can also think of this power dynamic in Stanley and Stella's relationship separately as fueled by sexual desire here. So, for example, Stella saying she can hardly stand it when he's away for a night. When he's away for a week, I nearly go wild. When he comes back, I cry on his lap like a baby, and smiles to herself. So this engagement with sexuality, this physicality, animalistic desire here that transcends everything else, that divorces reason from passion. Here we have her prioritizing desire over reason here, and being kind of in the throes of passion and completely in Stanley's hands here. Blanche as well, you sit and stare at me thinking I let the place go. I let the place go. Where were you? In bed with... again, that's a slur, so I'm not going to say it. But this thinking about Blanche juxtaposing her own fight with death with Stella literally making life here by becoming pregnant and having sex with Stanley. So here Blanche clinging to the past, Stella lustfully, sexually engaging with the future, creating a future. Eunice as well saying you can't beat on a woman then call her back, etc. But Stanley saying, I want her to come down with me, him calling her, and then she slips down the stairs, glistening with tears, her hair loose about her throat and shoulders. So they're this kind of undoing of her, this raw intimacy of her. They stare at each other, then they come together with low animal moans. He falls to his knees, so this kind of idea of submission there as well, and presses his face to her belly. So here, really the only kind of regret and self-abasement we see of Stanley's. But her eyes go blind with tenderness. So is her tenderness, her love of Stanley, blinding her to reality in a way that's not the same, but perhaps linked to Blanche's blindness about Alan Gray, about love, about reality, about the past? Perhaps. She catches his head and raises him to level with her, so forgives him, brings them back to their previous status there. And then he snatches the screen door open, so violence, lifts her off her feet and bears her into the dark flat, implying then that they're going to be having sex from here. And this sex is being this kind of renegotiation of the power dynamic between them and the thing that really is strongest with them. Not that they don't love each other, it seems that they do, but that love is based partly and fueled, importantly, by sex. Then Blanche, she ran downstairs and went back in there with him. Sure she did. So there's then acceptance within patriarchy because other male characters know that she's going to do this, because know their dynamic to a certain extent, but also are aware that that's her role, is to submit to her husband. Blanche as well, what are you talking about is brute desire, just desire, the name of that rattletrap streetcar that bangs through the quarters, up one narrow street and down another. So we have this idea of violence here, brutality with desire. Yes, violence and desire are linked here. Then we see the scene here with Stella the next day, lying down in the bedroom, face is serene, one hand rests on her belly, rounding slightly with the new maternity, so this being drawn as an eye here, linked with here. And the other dangles a book of coloured comics interesting that because we've got this idea then of infantilization again, right? She's reading like a kid's book, comic book. Her eyes and lips have that almost narcoticized tranquility that is the face of Eastern idols. So this kind of serenity, she's saying. But this idea that it's narcotized is this idea of her being drugged almost. So is she drugged by desire? Perhaps here. Stanley's gaudy pajamas lie across the threshold of the bathroom. So literally this limit here that define these boundaries of he has reclaimed the space. Sloppy the remains of breakfast debris. So we have this kind of chaos around them, but her stillness and tranquility, which suggests that that is her priority again. Blanche and then juxtaposed, sleepless night, entirely contrasts, nervous, etc., compared to this tranquility. Staring, what's the matter with you? So she doesn't understand why Blanche is so freaked out here. Really, because again, she can only see her own sexual fulfillment, her own sexual desire being fulfilled. Same with Stanley. It's going to be all right after she goes and after you've had the baby. Well, that's important, right? Because that will mean that she's able to have sex much more and be able to start this whole process over again when she's not pregnant and heavily pregnant as she is at this point in the play. It's going to be all right again between you and me, the way it was. Do you remember the way it was? The nights we had together? Again, it's not like the days, etc. It's the nights, particularly. That's this defining creation of love for them. God, honey, it's going to be sweet when we can make noise the way in the night, the way we used to, and get the colored lights going with nobody's sister behind the curtains to hear us. So this idea of privacy, intimacy, desire, wildness, enjoyment, etc., that Blanche is interrupting here. And this is part of the issue Stanley has with her, is this interruption there. And then marrying this commonness with this colored lights going again. So this then becomes a motif with the colors, the columns and the being pulled down, this idea of descent. Weren't we happy together? Describing me as an ape. So this idea then of reminding about the class differences between them. And Stella says there are things that happen between a man and woman in the dark that sort of make everything else seem unimportant. So this here is crucial to Stella. Everything else other than that is unimportant in contrast to that thing. And then Ahmed says Blanche uses their dependence on men again to expose and critique this treatment of women. This kind of submissiveness and passivity, but also desire here, right? The treatment of women as being this kind of receptor of sex, but also their fulfillment for the first time being important. Blackwell as well, Williams is making a commentary on Western culture by dramatizing his belief that men and women find reality and meaning in life through satisfactory sexual relationships. His drama derives from the characters' recognition of certain needs within themselves, Stella, and their consequent demands for the right mate. Frustration is the surface evidence of the predicament of his female characters, but Williams is careful to distinguish the underlying reasons for their behavior. So saying here, men and women find reality and meaning of life through satisfactory sexual relationships. So this is Stella here, and Stanley to a lesser extent as well. So here we're thinking of the fact that her world then is phallocentric, right? If it is centered around heterosexual sex with Stanley. Then Blackwell as well. Stella Kowalski is superior in background and personal endowments to her mate, but she subordinates herself to his way of life because they have a satisfying sexual relationship. So she has power over him, but the power that he has sexually over her is enough that she submits herself to him. And then let's think finally about her as a conduit between these worlds embodied by Blanche and Stella. So again, this idea of explaining the difference between Stanley and people from home, this different species that she understands that that is the case, and she explains it to Blanche because she knows Blanche needs to know. The same with Stella when she's talking to Stanley about Blanche, so the opposite here. When she comes in, be sure to say something nice about her appearance. Notice here the imperatives. She is saying it nicely, but she's still commanding him. She knows what's needed in this situation in a way Stanley doesn't. And oh, don't mention the baby. I haven't said anything yet. I'm waiting till she gets in a quieter condition. And try to understand her and be nice to her, Stan. She wasn't expecting to find us in such a small place. You see, I tried to gloss things over a little in my letters. And admire her dress and tell her she's looking wonderful. That's important with Blanche, her little weakness. So there, the idea of trying to help Stanley get on with Blanche, but also the revelation that she was trying to make her current situation seem more palatable to Blanche because she knew if she was real about it, that Blanche would fly off the handle about it. And the only person, again, who seems to understand Blanche. And then Stanley and diamonds, a crown for an empress, a rhinestone tiara she wore to a costume ball. What's rhinestone? Next to glass. Are you kidding? I have an acquaintance that works in a jewelry store. I'll have him here to make an appraisal of this. Here's your plantation, or what's left of it, here. You have no idea how stupid and horrid you're being. That's important, right? That Stella says, you don't understand what you're saying here. Now close that trunk before she comes out of the bathroom. He kicks the trunk partly closed and sits on the kitchen table. The Kowalskis and the Dubois have different notions. Indeed they have, thank heavens. I'm going outside. So this idea of her being able to have more information than him because she understands what rhinestones are and Stanley doesn't know what they are. And she can see the difference between diamonds because she's seen diamonds before and Stanley hasn't, and rhinestones, which he can't tell the difference, she can. Also say this kind of explanation of you don't understand what you're saying, and then this idea of they have different sort of views of the world, and she is then exaggerating that difference by saying, yes, they do. So you and I have different views of the world in this case. And then Stella as well, there's plenty of time to ask her questions later, but if you do now, she'll go to pieces again. I don't understand what happened to Belle Rev, but you don't know how ridiculous you're being when you suggest that my sister or I or anyone of our family could have perpetrated a swindle on anyone else. Look at the language she's using here. It's more sophisticated than Stanley's. And she knows that he hasn't met any of her family, so she is the expert here in this, and thus is holding this kind of power between these two worlds as this conduit between them. Stella says, your face and your fingers are disgustingly greasy. Go and wash up and then help me clear the table. He hurls a plate to the floor. That's how I'll clear the table. He seizes her arm. Don't ever talk to me that way. Pig, blank, disgusting, vulgar, greasy, them kind of words have been on your tongue and your sister's too much around here. What do you two think you are, a pair of queens? Remember what Huey Long said, every man is a king, and I am the king around here, so don't you forget it. He hurls a cup and saucer to the floor. My place is clear. You want me to clear your places? Stella begins to cry weakly. Stanley stalks out on the porch and lights a cigarette, etc. And then the music is heard here. So here we have when she starts to mimic her sister's language with Stanley, violence, 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 violence here, right? So that response to her resisting his total authority. And interesting, this reference here, Huey Long, who was a liberal politician who fought for the working class here. Every man is a king, meant to be sort of this motto of the working classes. And despite him recognizing that the other two have power over him in terms of their class, he is resisting that narrative and saying that is no longer the case, and I am the boss around here. And this really speaks to the intersectionality of power here, because though they are upper class, they are women, and though he is working class, he is a man. So the power dynamic is still absolutely tense here as they fight for who will win control. Because it's a patriarchal society, we know that this is going to be Stanley who wins. You didn't know Blanche as a girl. Nobody was tender as trusting as her, but people like you abused her and forced her to change. So interesting, this final piece here, when taken in contrast with Blanche's own getting jettisoned from Stella and Stella's rejection of Blanche at the end, where she was able to talk about this as this kind of precursor to what happens with Stanley and Blanche, but she can't see it when it actually is the case. So if she does see it, she chooses Stanley's world over Blanche's, because that's how she survives, and she can see that that's the way that it needs to go. With Bhabha, we can think of this idea of a third space, this continuous process of negotiating sense of culture and identity. So not being solely one thing or the other, but being a mix of two different identities is Stella here, and even more so will be the baby. And Williams as well is out of a regret for the South that no longer exists, that I write of the forces that destroyed it. So Stella, again, being one of those forces that is complicit in the destruction of the Old South, so the destruction of Blanche. These are several different ways you can talk about Stella and the other characters as well by proxy. Because, for example, if this is a question on relationships, you can use this paragraph here very easily in a question about relationships, because this is one element of the relationships in the text. And then we could focus, for example, on Stella and Stanley, on Blanche and Stella, and then perhaps on Blanche and Mitch as well, or relationships at the end of the play as well. And that will really bring us to a nice, fully rounded and very concentrated and focused essay. That brings us, actually, we've run a little bit over, but to the end of our lesson. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad you've done so. Thank you for everyone who contributed to the lesson. And I look forward to seeing you this time next week, same time, same place, for our lesson on Stanley. So we're going to see a lesson on Stanley and then a lesson on Mitch, and then we'll get into some of the different themes in January after our holiday break, in which we'll be able to talk much more about these different ideas still, but under the guise and under the lens of a specific theme, like, for example, masculinity, class, etc. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much again, and bye for now. Bye.